Julia Roberts' laugh stopped. Her face went pale. And the voice from the back corner of the studio changed everything. It was March 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Another Thursday night taping. Another sold-out audience. Another A-list celebrity guest ready to charm America with stories and laughter. Julia Roberts walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, that megawatt smile lighting up the studio like it had for 3 decades. She hugged Jimmy, waved to the crowd, settled into the guest chair with the effortless grace of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly what audiences expected when Julia Roberts appeared on late-night television. Charm, warmth, that infectious laugh that had captivated the world since Pretty Woman. Jimmy launched into his first question, something about her latest film project. Julia was animated, gesturing with her hands, her eyes sparkling, building to what was clearly going to be a funny punchline. And then a voice called out from somewhere near the studio entrance. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just one word, spoken with trembling emotion. Jules! Julia Roberts stopped mid-sentence. Her hands froze in the air. The smile vanished from her face like someone had flipped a switch. Her skin went ashen. Her eyes, which had been full of life and energy seconds ago, went wide with something that looked like shock mixed with disbelief. The audience noticed immediately. The laughter that had been building died in their throats. Jimmy stopped his follow-up question, his expression shifting from entertainer to genuinely concerned friend. Julia? Jimmy said carefully. You okay? Julia didn't respond. She was staring past the cameras, past the audience, toward the back left corner of the studio where audience members stood when the tiered seating was full. Her breathing had gone shallow. One hand gripped the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The Roots stopped playing their subtle background music. Questlove lowered his drumsticks, following Julia's line of sight. The cameras tried to figure out what was happening, operators looking between Julia's frozen face and the back corner she was staring at. Jimmy stood up from his desk, something he rarely did during interviews unless it was planned. Jules, what's wrong? Do you need a minute? We can. Who said that? Julia's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the studio it carried perfectly. Who just said my name? The audience shifted uncomfortably. People turned in their seats, trying to see who Julia was looking at. From the back corner, a man stepped forward slightly. Older, maybe late 60s. Gray hair. Worn jacket. He raised one hand tentatively, almost apologetically. I did, the man said, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I couldn't believe it was really you. Julia's other hand flew to her chest. She stood up from the guest chair, completely unscripted, completely unplanned. Jimmy reached out instinctively, not sure if she was about to collapse or run or what. Danny? Julia's voice broke on the name. Danny Moder, Sr.? The man in the back nodded, tears already streaming down his weathered face. Yeah, Jules. It's me. The control room erupted into controlled chaos. Director Dave Diamandis was frantically trying to figure out what was happening. Producers were talking into headsets, asking if this was planned, if they should cut to commercial, if someone needed to intervene. But Jimmy Fallon, standing beside his frozen guests, made a decision in that split second that would define his career. Keep rolling, he said quietly to the nearest camera operator. Then louder to the audience. Folks, I think we need to stop everything for a minute here. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 22 years earlier. Julia Roberts wasn't always married to cinematographer Daniel Moder. She'd been married before, a brief marriage in her 20s that ended in divorce. She'd dated actors and musicians. She'd become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, but her personal life had been tabloid fodder for years. In 2002, she met Danny Moder on the set of The Mexican. He was a camera operator. She was the lead actress. They fell in love, real, deep, lasting love, despite the complications. Danny was married to someone else at the time. The media crucified them. But Danny got divorced, and in July 2002, Julia Roberts married Daniel Moder in a quiet ceremony at her ranch in New Mexico. What most people didn't know, what Julia had kept intensely private for over 2 decades, was how much Danny's father had meant to her. Daniel Moder Sr. had been a cinematographer too, legendary in the industry but not a household name. He'd worked on major films throughout the 70s and 80s, the kind of cameraman that directors requested specifically because he understood light and emotion in ways most technicians never would. When Julia met Danny's family for the first time, she'd been terrified. The media scrutiny around their relationship was brutal. She was Julia Roberts, America's sweetheart, and she'd fallen in love with a married man. The narrative was ugly. She expected Danny's family to hate her. Daniel Sr. had opened the door of his modest Los Angeles home, looked at Julia standing nervously on his doorstep, and said, "You're the one who makes my son smile like he did when he was 8 years old. Come in. Your family now." He treated her like a daughter from day one. Not Julia Roberts, the movie star. Just Jules, the woman his son loved. When the tabloids were vicious, when the paparazzi camped outside her house, when the world seemed determined to tear their relationship apart, Daniel Sr. would call her. "Don't read that garbage, Jules," he'd say in his gruff, warm voice. "Danny loves you. You love him. That's all that matters. The rest is just noise." He taught her about cinematography, about how cameras tell stories, about finding beauty in ordinary moments. When Julia was pregnant with her first child, Daniel Sr. spent hours showing her old footage he'd shot, telling stories about lighting and composition that were really about patience and love. "Every frame tells a story," he'd said, showing her footage from a film she'd never heard of. "But the best frames, the ones that matter, they capture what's real. Not what's perfect. What's real." In 2006, Daniel Moder Sr. was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Julia watched this brilliant, warm, generous man slowly disappear. The disease took his memories first, names, then faces, then entire relationships. Danny was devastated. Julia tried to help however she could, visiting, bringing the kids to see their grandfather, sitting with him even when he didn't remember who she was. By 2008, Daniel Sr. didn't recognize his own son anymore. He'd been moved to a memory care facility. Julia would visit sometimes, sitting with this man who'd welcomed her as family, who'd defended her when the world was cruel, who'd taught her that real beauty wasn't in perfect lighting but in honest moments. One day in early 2009, she'd visited and Daniel Sr. had looked at her with clear confusion. "Do I know you?" he'd asked. "I'm Jules," she'd said, fighting tears. "I'm married to your son Danny." He'd smiled politely, the way you smile at a stranger being kind. "That's nice. Danny's a good boy." That was the last conversation they'd had where he'd spoken in complete sentences. The disease accelerated. 6 months later, in August 2009, Daniel Moder Sr. passed away in the memory care facility, surrounded by family he no longer recognized. Julia had been devastated in a way that surprised her. This wasn't her father. But he'd been a father to her when she needed one. She'd given a eulogy at his funeral that she could barely get through. She'd held Danny while he sobbed. And she'd made peace with the fact that the last years of his life, he hadn't known who she was. Except apparently, that wasn't true. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Standing in the back corner of the Tonight Show studio, the man who'd called out Julia's name wasn't Daniel Moder Sr. That was impossible. He'd died 15 years ago. This was his identical twin brother, David Moder. Julia hadn't known Danny's father had a twin. No one in the family talked about it. David had moved to Australia in the 1970s after a falling out with his brother over something no one could even remember anymore. They'd been estranged for 40 years. David hadn't come to Daniel's funeral. Hadn't even known his brother had Alzheimer's. Hadn't known he died. David had only recently returned to the United States, trying to reconnect with family, trying to make peace with a lifetime of regret over a stupid argument he couldn't even remember the details of. He'd reached out to Danny Motor Jr., his nephew he'd never met, 2 weeks ago. Danny had been kind but guarded. The wounds of his father's death were still raw, even 15 years later. Tonight David had won tickets to The Tonight Show through a radio contest. Pure chance. He'd been sitting in the back, enjoying the show, when Jimmy introduced Julia Roberts, his brother's daughter-in-law. The woman Daniel had loved like his own child. David had seen photos over the years. Danny Jr. had sent some when they'd first started talking. But seeing her in person, hearing her laugh, watching her smile, it was like seeing his brother again. The way she moved her hands when she talked. The way her whole face lit up with joy. Daniel used to talk about light and emotion, and somehow Julia Roberts embodied both. And without thinking, without meaning to disrupt anything, David had whispered his brother's nickname for her. Jules. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy walked toward the back of the studio. The cameras followed him uncertainly. The audience parted to create a path. Julia stood frozen at the guest chair, one hand still pressed against her chest, tears streaming down her face. Jimmy reached David Motor, who looked mortified, like he wanted to disappear. "I'm so sorry," David said to Jimmy, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean to ruin your show. She looks so much like family and I." "What's your name, sir?" Jimmy asked gently. David Motor. I was Danny's brother. Daniel Sr. Julia's, her father-in-law's twin brother." Jimmy's eyes widened. He turned back toward Julia, who had sunk back into the guest chair, her hands covering her face. "Julia," Jimmy called across the studio, his voice amplified by his lapel mic. "Did you know Danny's dad had a twin brother?" Julia lowered her hands, shaking her head. "No. He never. Danny never mentioned." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jimmy made a decision that the producers would later call either the bravest or most reckless moment in Tonight Show history. "David," Jimmy said, "would you like to come meet Julia properly?" David's eyes went wide. "I couldn't. I've already disrupted." "I think you need to," Jimmy said firmly. Then to the audience. "Folks, we're way off script here, but I think you'll understand why." He walked David Motor through the parted audience, across the studio floor, past the Roots, who were watching with rapt attention, to where Julia sat in the guest chair. She stood up slowly as they approached, wiping tears from her face, trying to compose herself and failing completely. David stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. "You look just like him," Julia whispered. "Exactly like him. The way he looked before the Alzheimer's," David finished softly. "Danny Jr. told me. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry for so many things. He talked about you," Julia said suddenly. "Early on, before the disease got bad. He told me once that he had a brother he'd lost touch with. He said it was his biggest regret. That he couldn't remember what they'd fought about, but he remembered loving you." David's face crumpled. "I wasted 40 years being angry over nothing." Julia stepped forward and wrapped her arms around this stranger who looked exactly like the father-in-law she'd lost. David held onto her like she was a lifeline to his brother, sobbing into her shoulder, while 300 people and millions at home watched in reverent silence. Jimmy stood nearby, tears streaming down his own face, one hand over his mouth. After a long moment, Julia pulled back and reached up to her neck. She unclasped a delicate silver necklace, a small camera pendant that Danny Sr. had given her years ago. "He gave this to me when I was pregnant with my first baby," Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. He said it was to remind me that the best moments aren't the ones you pose for. They're the real ones. I want you to have it. He would want his brother to have it. David shook his head. I can't. You can't, Julia insisted, placing it in his palm and closing his fingers around it. Because you're family. And you're here now. That's what matters. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The audience erupted in applause. Standing ovation. Jimmy hugged them both. The Roots played softly in the background. After the show, Julia called Danny and told him everything. 2 weeks later, David Moder had dinner with his nephew's family for the first time. He's been part of their lives ever since. The necklace never left David's pocket. And Julia Roberts gained the family member her father-in-law had always wanted to reconcile with but never could.